Don't touch him. People like that don't get saved. The voice came from somewhere behind her, low, certain, like it had already decided the man's fate. But Amara Lewis didn't turn around. Not yet. Because in front of her, under a flickering streetlight on an empty stretch of road just outside the city limits, a man lay motionless on the cold asphalt, his expensive coat soaked through with rain, his hand barely twitching like it was trying to hold onto something invisible. And for a second, just 1 second, Amara kept walking, her sneakers splashing through shallow puddles, her mind already listing everything she couldn't afford. Trouble, delays, missed hours, another night docked from her paycheck at a job that barely covered rent. But then the wind shifted, sharp and cold, carrying a sound so faint most people would have missed it. A breath, uneven, fragile, human, and that was enough to stop her, because Amara knew that sound. The sound of someone not gone, not yet. The sound of someone waiting, whether they knew it or not, for someone else to decide if they mattered. And slowly, reluctantly, she turned back, her chest tightening as she stepped closer, each footstep heavier than the last, her eyes scanning the empty road. No cars, no witnesses, just the hum of distant traffic miles away and the steady rhythm of rain tapping against pavement. And when she finally reached him, she crouched down, careful, cautious, her fingers hovering just above his shoulder before making contact, like she was asking permission from a stranger who couldn't answer. "Hey," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the rain. "Can you hear me?" But there was no response, only that same uneven breath. And up close, the details didn't make sense. The tailored fabric, the polished shoes, the kind of watch you only saw behind glass counters. Everything about him said power, status, a life far removed from nights like this. And yet here he was, alone, unnoticed, reduced to something fragile, something human, and Amara felt it. Then, that familiar pull between survival and something deeper, something harder to ignore, because helping him meant risk, real risk, the kind that didn't come with applause or guarantees, just consequences, questions, maybe even danger. And somewhere behind her, that voice spoke again, sharper this time. "Walk away," it said. "This isn't your problem." And maybe that voice was right. Maybe it always was, but Amara had spent too many years watching people look away, too many nights being the one no one stopped for, and she wasn't sure she could live with herself if she became one of them. So she exhaled slowly, the decision settling in her bones before she could second-guess it. And this time, when her hand touched his shoulder, it didn't hesitate. "You're not staying here," she whispered, more to herself than to him, already shifting her weight, already figuring out how to move him, how to get him somewhere safe, somewhere warm, because whatever he was, whoever he was, right now he was just a man on the ground, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, that was enough. The rain did not slow down. It pressed harder, like the night itself was testing her decision, and Amara felt the weight of it as she tried to lift him, her hand slipping slightly against the damp fabric of his coat, her breath tightening as she adjusted her grip. "Come on," she murmured under her breath, not expecting an answer but needing to say it anyway. And slowly, inch by inch, she managed to pull him toward the narrow sidewalk, her muscles burning, her sneakers dragging against wet concrete, every movement deliberate, careful, because even without understanding his condition, she knew he could not move on his own, not fully, not yet. And that realization settled in quietly, heavier than the rain, heavier than the silence around them, because this was no longer just about helping someone up. This was about carrying someone who could not carry himself. And as she finally got him propped against the base of a streetlight, she paused, her chest rising and falling, her eyes scanning his face more closely now, searching for something, anything that told her he was still there. And for a moment, his eyelids fluttered, barely, but enough to send a sharp wave of urgency through her. "Stay with me," she said, her voice steadier now, more certain, as if saying it could anchor him in place. And then she looked around again, the emptiness of the road suddenly louder, more dangerous, because now she understood what she was really up against. Not just the cold, not just the distance, but time, and time was not on his side. So she moved faster, pulling her phone from her pocket, only to see the signal flicker weakly, one bar, then none, the kind of unreliable connection that made promises it could not keep, and she clenched her jaw, making a decision before frustration could settle in, because waiting was not an option, not tonight, not for him. And that was when she noticed it, the faint reflection of headlights in the distance, slow, deliberate, not passing by, not in a hurry, just there, watching, or maybe searching, and something about it made her stomach tighten, a quiet instinct she had learned not to ignore, because people who moved like that at this hour were not just driving, they were looking, and she did not know for what, but she knew she did not want them finding it here, not like this, not with him defenseless and exposed. So without hesitation, she reached for the small utility cart she had dragged from behind the closed diner down the block, the one she used to haul trash at the end of her shifts, and it was not meant for this, not meant for a person, but it was all she had, and carefully, with more strength than she thought she had left, she maneuvered him onto it, adjusting his arms so they would not slip, steadying his head with her folded jacket, her movements quick but precise, because there was no room for mistakes, not anymore. And as she began to push, the wheels protested softly against the uneven pavement, a low creak that sounded too loud in the quiet night. But she kept going, her eyes flicking once more toward those distant headlights, still there, still slow, and now, unmistakably, closer, and something inside her shifted then, something sharper, more focused, because this was no longer just an act of kindness. It was becoming something else, something she could not yet name, but she felt it all the same, in the way her steps quickened, in the way her grip tightened around the handle of that cart, in the way her voice dropped to a whisper as she leaned closer to him and said, "I do not know who you are, but you are not staying out here tonight." And for the first time since she found him, it did not feel like a choice. It felt like a line had been drawn, and she had already crossed it. The wheels rattled louder now, every crack in the pavement echoing through the empty street as Amara pushed harder, her arms trembling from the strain but refusing to stop, because behind her, those headlights were no longer distant. They were deliberate, closing in with a patience that felt calculated, and she did not need to see the driver to know this was not random, not coincidence. This was someone searching, and something told her it was him they were searching for. So she turned sharply into a narrow side alley she knew from late shifts, a shortcut most people ignored, the kind of place where shadows stayed longer than light. And for a moment, the sound of the cart softened as the ground turned smoother, the alley shielding them just enough to break the direct line of sight. And she did not stop there. She kept going until the neon glow of the closed diner came into view, its sign flickering weakly above a back entrance that only staff used, and with a quick glance over her shoulder, she pulled the door open and dragged the cart inside, letting it shut quietly behind her as the outside world disappeared into muffled rain and distant engines. And for the first time since she found him, there was a fragile sense of separation, not safety, not yet, but distance, and that was enough to let her breathe, just for a second, before reality rushed back in, because now he was inside. Now he was her responsibility in a way that felt heavier than before, and she moved quickly, guiding the cart toward the storage area, her mind already shifting into something sharper, more practical, the way it always did when things got hard, because panic did not solve anything. Action did, and she had learned that the hard way, so she grabbed a stack of old towels, laying them down on the floor before carefully lowering him onto them, adjusting his position so he would not roll, her hands steady despite the exhaustion settling into her bones, and up close, the details became clearer, the faint rise and fall of his chest, the slight tension in his fingers, the quiet signs that he was still fighting, still here, and she reached for a clean cloth, dampening it with warm water from the sink before gently wiping the rain from his face, her movements slow, deliberate, not out of fear, but out of respect, because whatever had happened to him before this moment, whatever life he had lived, right now he was just someone who needed help, and that was all that mattered. And as she worked, her eyes caught something near his collar, a small metallic glint partially hidden beneath the fabric, and she hesitated for a second, then reached carefully, pulling it free just enough to see what it was, a card, sleek, minimal, the kind you did not carry unless it meant something. And for a moment, she just stared at it, her mind trying to process the name printed across its surface, because it did not fit. It did not match the man lying on the floor in front of her, Not like this, not here. And yet there it was, clear and undeniable, and her breath caught slightly as she read it again, slower this time, like saying it in her head might make more sense. But it did not. It only made everything heavier, more complicated, because this was not just a stranger anymore. This was someone with a life far beyond this room. Someone people would be looking for, someone important enough to matter in ways she could not ignore. And for a brief second, doubt crept in, sharp and unwelcome, because helping him now meant stepping into something bigger than she had planned, bigger than she wanted, and she closed her eyes, just for a moment, letting that weight settle, before opening them again, steadier this time, her voice quiet but certain as she placed the card back against his chest and whispered, "Whoever you are out there, it does not change what happens in here." And in that small, dimly lit room, with the sound of rain tapping softly against the walls, the line between two completely different worlds had already begun to disappear. The room felt smaller now, not because the walls had moved, but because the weight of what she had just realized was settling into every corner, pressing in quietly as Amara sat back on her heels for a moment, her eyes drifting from the man on the floor to the faint glow of the diner's front window, where rain streaked down in uneven lines, distorting the outside world into something distant and unreachable. And for a second, she let herself feel it. The shift, the moment when a simple act of helping someone turned into something far more complicated. Because names like the one on that card did not exist in places like this. They belonged to boardrooms, headlines, places where decisions shaped lives from miles away, not on the cold tile floor of a storage room behind a closed diner. And yet here he was, breathing unevenly, completely dependent on someone he would probably never have noticed under any other circumstance. And that thought lingered longer than she expected. Not bitter, not angry, just real, because Amara had spent enough time in rooms where people like him made choices that people like her had to live with. And now, somehow, their worlds had collided in the most unexpected way, but she did not have time to sit with that. Not for long, because a low sound pulled her attention back, a faint exhale that was different this time, more deliberate, and she leaned forward immediately, her focus snapping back to him as his fingers twitched again, slightly stronger than before, like his body was trying to reconnect with itself. And without thinking, she reached for his hand, steadying it gently. "You are still here," she said softly, not as a question but as a quiet confirmation. And for a brief moment, his eyes moved beneath closed lids, not opening, not yet, but enough to show that somewhere inside, he was aware. And that was enough to keep her moving, because awareness meant time, and time meant a chance. So she stood quickly, moving to the small cabinet along the wall where basic supplies were kept, grabbing a clean blanket, a bottle of water, anything she could use to stabilize him, her movements efficient, practiced in the way people become when they have had to figure things out on their own more times than they can count. And as she returned, draping the blanket carefully over him, she paused again, this time listening, not to him, but to the outside, because something had changed, the steady rhythm of rain now broken by a distant engine, slower than before, closer, and her body reacted before her mind fully processed it, her shoulders tightening slightly, her gaze shifting toward the back door, because even through the walls, she could feel it, that same presence from the road, not gone, not past, still searching, and the realization settled in with quiet clarity. They had not given up, whoever they were, and that meant this was not over, not even close. And for the first time since she brought him inside, the risk became real in a way that could not be ignored, because helping him was no longer just about compassion, it was about protection, about choosing to stand between him and whatever had put him out there in the first place. And that was not a small choice, not something you walked away from easily, and she felt the weight of it as she knelt beside him again, her hand resting lightly near his shoulder, grounding herself as much as him. And for a moment, she closed her eyes, just long enough to steady her thoughts, before opening them again with something firmer behind them, something resolved, because whatever this situation had become, she was already in it, already part of it, and backing out now would not undo that. So instead, she leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper but steady in a way that surprised even her. "Whoever is out there looking for you, they are not getting you tonight." And in the quiet that followed, With rain tapping softly against the windows and an unknown danger lingering just beyond the walls, the balance of power had already begun to shift, not in boardrooms or headlines, but here, in a place no one important was supposed to notice. The sound came again, closer this time. Not loud, but unmistakable. The slow roll of tires against wet pavement just outside, and Amara froze for half a second. Her breath caught somewhere between instinct and thought as her eyes moved toward the back door, every sense sharpening at once, because it was no longer a question of if someone was out there, it was who, and more importantly, how close they were willing to get. And without wasting another second, she stood and moved quickly across the room, her steps light but urgent as she reached the switch near the wall and turned off the remaining overhead light, letting the space fall into a softer dimness lit only by the faint glow leaking in from the front of the diner, shadows stretching longer now, deeper, offering just enough cover without completely blinding her, and she paused there, listening, really. Listening, her heartbeat loud in her ears as the engine outside slowed even more, then idled, and that stillness carried something heavier than noise ever could, because silence like that was intentional, calculated, and she had learned long ago that silence was often when decisions were being made, not spoken, and her mind began moving faster, connecting pieces she did not fully understand but could not ignore, the expensive clothes, the identification card, the way he had been left out there. Not hidden, not gone, just exposed, like someone expected him to be found or maybe not found at all, and neither option sat right with her, not anymore. So she turned back toward him, kneeling again but this time with a different energy, something more focused, more protective, as if the line she had crossed earlier had now locked into place, and she adjusted the blanket around him, making sure he was covered. Her movements quieter now, more deliberate, because every small sound felt amplified in the tension of the moment. And then, without thinking too long about it, she reached for the old radio kept on the shelf near the counter, the one the night staff used for weather updates, turning the volume down to its lowest setting before switching it on, letting the faint static fill the space just enough to mask any small movements, a subtle layer of noise that might go unnoticed from the outside, and she returned to his side, her hand hovering briefly before resting lightly near his arm, grounding both of them in a way she could not explain. And for a moment, everything held still, the rain, the room, even her thoughts, until a faint flicker of light passed across the narrow window near the door, headlights sweeping by slowly, too slowly, and her body tensed instinctively, her eyes locking onto that strip of glass as the light lingered, then moved, then lingered again, like someone was scanning, checking, not rushing, and she held her breath without realizing it, counting, silently in her head, 1, 2, 3, waiting for the moment it would either stop completely or disappear, and when it finally moved on, the engine sound fading just enough to suggest distance but not absence, she exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, but the tension did not leave, it shifted, settled deeper, because now she knew, this was not over. Whoever was out there had not made a mistake. They were being careful, patient, and that made everything more dangerous, not less. And she glanced down at him again, studying his face as if searching for answers he could not yet give, and for the first time, a question formed clearly in her mind, not about who he was, but why someone like him would end up here, like this, and before she could stop herself, she spoke it softly into the quiet. What did you walk into? And there was no answer. Only the steady rhythm of his breathing, a fragile reminder that whatever this was, it was still unfolding, still moving forward whether she was ready or not. And as she sat there in the dim light, listening to the fading sound of the car outside, Amara understood one thing with absolute clarity. This night was not going to end quietly, and neither was the choice she had made. The silence stretched longer than it should have, the kind that made every small sound feel louder, sharper, more important, and Amara stayed exactly where she was, her eyes fixed on the narrow window, as if expecting those headlights to return at any second. But they did not, at least not yet, and that was what unsettled her the most, because people who left too quickly were careless, but people who took their time, who circled back, who waited, those were the ones who planned, and she could feel it now, deep in her chest. This was not random. This was deliberate. and she was already part of it whether she liked it or not. So she shifted her focus back to him, grounding herself in something she could control, something real, and she reached for the bottle of water again, pouring a small amount onto the cloth before gently pressing it against his temple. Careful, steady, her movements guided more by instinct than training. Because she had never done this before, not like this, not with stakes she could not fully see. And yet she did not hesitate, not anymore, because hesitation belonged to people who had options, and right now, he did not. And that made the decision simple in a way that felt almost unfair, and as she adjusted the blanket again, making sure it stayed in place, she noticed it, a slight change. Subtle but undeniable, his breathing had steadied, just a little, less uneven than before, and she leaned closer, watching carefully, her own breath slowing to match his rhythm, as if syncing with him might somehow keep him anchored. "That is it," she whispered, her voice low but firm. "Stay with me." And for a brief moment, his fingers moved again, not just a twitch this time, but a small, intentional shift, like he was trying to respond, trying to reach back from wherever he was, and that single movement sent a quiet surge of relief through her. Not enough to relax, not enough to change the situation, but enough to remind her that this was working, that her choice mattered, and she held on to that, because she needed something to hold on to, something that made sense in the middle of everything that did not. And then, without warning, the radio crackled softly, breaking through the low static with a voice just clear enough to catch her attention, a routine late-night update. But the words that followed made her freeze where she knelt. "Authorities are asking for any information regarding the disappearance of Daniel Crawford, CEO of Crawford Holdings," the voice said calmly, almost too calmly, as if reading from a script that did not understand the weight of the name it carried. Last seen earlier this evening, believed to be traveling alone, and Amara did not move, not even as the radio continued, because the name landed heavier than anything she had read on that card. Heavier because now it was real, now it was confirmed, not just a piece of metal in her hand but a voice out in the world, a search already underway, and slowly, almost without thinking, her eyes shifted back down to him, studying his face again with a different awareness, because now she knew, not just who he was, but how many people would be looking, how far this would reach, and the room felt even smaller because of it, like the walls were closing in around a secret that was already too big to hold. And for a moment, doubt returned, sharper this time, louder, telling her this was beyond her, that this was something she should hand over, step away from, let the world handle it. But just as quickly as it came, it met something stronger, something quieter but more certain, because she remembered the road, the rain, the way no one stopped, the way he would still be out there if she had listened to that voice telling her to walk away. And that was enough to silence everything else. So instead of stepping back, she leaned forward, her voice steady as she spoke into the quiet space between them. "They are looking for you now," she said softly, not expecting him to understand, not expecting anything at all. "But they are not the ones who found you." And in that moment, with the radio humming quietly in the background and the storm still pressing against the windows, the truth settled in fully. She was no longer just helping him survive the night. She was holding something the rest of the world had already started searching for, and there was no simple way out of that. For a long moment after the radio fell quiet, nothing moved except the slow rhythm of his breathing and the soft tapping of rain against the windows, and Amara stayed there beside him, her thoughts shifting in ways she could not fully control, because knowing his name changed something, not in how she treated him, but in how heavy the situation had become, and she could feel that weight pressing in now, not just from outside but from inside her own mind, asking questions she did not have answers to, questions about what came next, about who she could trust, about whether helping him meant putting herself directly in the path of whatever had already gone wrong. And as those thoughts circled, his hand moved again, more clearly this time, fingers tightening just slightly against the fabric beneath them, and she noticed immediately, leaning closer without hesitation, her focus narrowing to that one small sign of life. "Hey," she said gently, her voice steady but softer than before. "Stay with me." And this time, something changed, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. His eyelids flickered again, longer, heavier, as if he was trying to push through something thick and distant, and Amara held still, not wanting to rush it, not wanting to break whatever fragile connection was forming, and slowly, just enough to matter, his eyes opened a fraction, unfocused, unclear, but open, and for a second, they did not land anywhere, just drifted, searching without direction, until finally they settled somewhere near her, not quite on her, but close enough that she knew he could see something, someone, and she felt it then, that shift, the moment when he was no longer just a body she was trying to keep alive, but a person starting to return, and she did not speak right away, giving him space, letting him find his way back piece by piece, because she understood that feeling more than most. The slow climb back into awareness when everything felt distant and unfamiliar, and after a few seconds, his lips parted. Slightly, no words at first, just a breath that sounded like effort. Like forming even a single thought took more strength than he had, and she leaned in just a little closer, her voice calm, grounding. "You are safe," she said quietly, choosing her words carefully, not explaining, not overwhelming him, just giving him something simple to hold on to, and his gaze shifted again, this time more focused, more aware, and for a brief moment, confusion flickered across his face, subtle but unmistakable, as if nothing around him made sense. Not the room, not her, not even himself. And that confusion deepened into something else, something heavier, like he was trying to remember something that would not come, and Amara saw it. The strain behind his eyes, the way his body remained still despite the effort, and she understood without needing him to say it. Something was wrong beyond the obvious, something deeper than exhaustion or shock, and she placed her hand gently near his, not gripping, not forcing. Just there, a steady point of contact. "Do not try to move yet," she said softly, her tone calm but firm, and he seemed to respond to that, not with words, but with stillness, like he understood more than he could express. And then, after a long pause, his lips moved again, this time forming something faint, barely audible, a single word that came out broken but clear enough to reach her. "Where?" And it hung there between them, unfinished, uncertain, but real. And Amara felt the weight of that question settle in, because answering it meant stepping further into something she could not fully control. But she did not hesitate, not anymore, because she had already made her choice hours ago on that road, and there was no going back. So she met his gaze, steady and grounded, and answered simply, "You are somewhere safe." And for a moment, that was enough, not because it explained everything, but because it gave him something to hold on to, something stable in the middle of everything uncertain. And as his eyes slowly closed again, not slipping away but resting this time, Amara stayed right there beside him, knowing that whatever came next, this was only the beginning, and the world outside was already moving closer. The moment his eyes closed again, the room seemed to exhale with him, not in relief but in a fragile pause, the kind that only existed between two uncertain outcomes. And Amara stayed exactly where she was, her hand still resting lightly near his, as if pulling away too soon might undo whatever small progress he had made. And for a few seconds, she allowed herself to just listen, not to the storm or the distant world beyond the walls, but to him, to the steady rhythm of his breathing that had become the only thing grounding this entire situation in something real, something she could measure, and yet even that felt temporary, like it could shift at any moment. And that thought alone kept her alert, kept her present, because she understood now that this was not just about keeping him alive, it was about keeping him hidden, at least for now. And that realization settled in deeper than anything else had so far, because hiding someone like him was not something you did halfway, not something you stumbled through without consequence. And she could feel those consequences already forming just beyond the edges of this quiet room, waiting, patient, just like those headlights had been. And slowly, she stood, her legs stiff from kneeling too long, her eyes scanning the space with a different awareness, not just as a place she worked, but as a place she now had to protect. And she moved quickly but carefully, checking the locks again, adjusting the blinds at the front just enough to block any clear view inside without making it obvious from the outside. Her movements controlled, intentional, because she knew that people who were looking would notice anything out of place, anything that suggested someone was here when they should not be. And as she worked, her mind kept returning to the same question, not who he was, because she already knew that, but why. Why someone like him would end up alone, injured, and unprotected in a place like this. Because people with power did not move through the world without layers, without systems designed to keep them from ever reaching a point like that. And yet here he was, stripped of all of it, reduced to something vulnerable in a way that did not fit the image she had always associated with names like his. And that contradiction stayed with her as she returned to his side, lowering herself back down, her eyes studying his face again, looking not for answers this time, but for signs, any small change that told her what direction this was going. And as if responding to that silent observation, his breathing shifted slightly, deeper now, more even, and she let out a quiet breath she had not realized she was holding, because that meant something, even if she could not define it yet. And then, almost imperceptibly, his head moved a fraction, just enough to catch her attention again, and she leaned closer, watching carefully, her voice soft but ready. "You are okay," she said, not because she knew it was true, but because sometimes words created space for truth to follow. And for a moment, nothing happened, just the steady rise and fall of his chest, until finally, his lips parted again, slower this time, more controlled, and a faint sound followed, not a full word, not yet, but closer than before, like he was reaching for something just out of range. And Amara did not interrupt, did not rush him, because she understood that whatever he said next mattered, not just to him, but to everything unfolding around them. And as she waited, the storm outside softened slightly, the rain easing into a quieter rhythm, but the tension inside the room did not fade with it, because both of them, whether fully aware or not, were now part of something that had already begun to move beyond their control. And in that quiet space between breaths and unspoken questions, the next step was already forming, even if neither of them could see it yet. The sound finally came, not loud, not sudden, but enough to break the fragile stillness that had settled between them, a faint whisper of a word forming again on his lips, and this time Amara leaned in closer without hesitation, her focus narrowing completely as if the rest of the world had stepped back just to let this moment unfold. And she could see it now, the effort behind it, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his breath caught, as if even speaking required strength he was not sure he had. And when the word finally came through, it was clearer than before, still weak, but unmistakable. No phone. And it lingered there, incomplete, but meaningful. And Amara did not respond right away, not because she did not understand, but because she did, more than he probably realized, because that was not just a request, it was a warning, and something about the way he said it, the urgency hidden beneath the weakness, told her this mattered. So instead of reaching for her phone, instead of reacting the way most people would, she stayed still, her eyes studying his face carefully as if searching for confirmation. And he gave it without needing to say more, a slight shift in his expression, a tension that spoke louder than any explanation could. And that was enough for her to understand that calling someone, anyone, might not be the safe choice it should have been. And that realization changed everything again, because until now, there had always been an option in the back of her mind. The idea that if things got too complicated, she could hand this over, let someone else take control. But now that option felt uncertain, unstable, like stepping into something she could not see, and she felt that shift settle in as she slowly nodded, more to herself than to him. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice steady but thoughtful. "No phone." And for a brief moment, something in his expression eased, not relief exactly, but recognition, like he understood that she had heard him, really heard him, and that alone created a different kind of connection between them. One that did not rely on explanations or trust built over time, but on a single decision made in the right moment. And as that settled, Amara sat back slightly, her mind moving quickly now, reworking everything she thought she knew about the situation. Because if calling for help was not safe, then whatever had put him out there was bigger than she had assumed, more organized, more controlled, and that thought tightened something in her chest. Not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that made every choice feel heavier, more deliberate. And she glanced toward the door again, listening, because now the silence outside felt different, not empty, but watchful, like it could shift at any moment. And she knew she could not stay still forever, could not just wait and hope this resolved on its own. So she leaned forward again, her her voice low but direct this time. "Then you are going to have to help me," she said, not demanding, not pushing, but clear in a way that cut through the uncertainty. Because if they were going to get through this, she needed something from him, anything that gave her direction. And for a second, it seemed like he might fade again, his eyes drifting, his energy slipping. But then, slowly, with visible effort, he focused again, his gaze locking closer onto hers than before. And this time, when he spoke, the word came with more intention, more weight, even if it was still barely above a whisper. "Trust no one." And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before, because those two words did not just answer her. They expanded the problem in a way she could not ignore. And as she sat there, absorbing it, feeling the full impact settle in, Amara understood that whatever this night had become, it was no longer just about survival or even protection. It was about navigating something she could not see, something that reached beyond this room, beyond this street, and possibly beyond anything she had ever dealt with before. And yet, despite all of that, she did not pull back, did not step away, because somewhere between the road, the rain, and this moment, she had already made her choice, and there was no version of this where she turned back now. The words did not fade after he said them. They stayed, hanging in the air with a weight that pressed into every corner of the room. Trust no one. And Amara felt it settle deep, not as fear, but as a shift in how she understood everything around her. Because those three words did not just warn her, they erased every easy option she had left. And for a moment, she said nothing, just watched him as his eyes drifted again. The effort of speaking pulling him back toward exhaustion. But this time it was different. This time he was not slipping away completely, just resting at the edge, like he was still holding on, still present enough to matter. And that alone told her something. He was choosing his words carefully, giving her only what she needed, nothing more. And she understood why. Because in a situation like this, information was not just helpful, it was dangerous. And that realization sharpened her focus even more. So instead of asking more questions, instead of pushing him for answers he clearly could not give yet, she shifted her attention outward, toward the problem itself. Because if trusting no one was the rule, then she had to start thinking differently, moving differently. And she stood slowly, her mind already mapping the space again, not just as a hiding place, but as a temporary solution that would not hold forever. Because places like this were not meant to keep secrets, not for long. And she moved toward the front of the diner, careful with each step, her eyes adjusting to the dim light as she reached the narrow gap between the blinds, just enough to see the street without revealing herself. And outside, the rain had eased into a light mist, the road reflecting the faint glow of distant streetlights, empty at first glance. But Amara did not trust first glances anymore, so she stayed there longer, watching, letting her eyes pick up the small details, the subtle shifts, the things most people would miss. And after a few seconds, she saw it. Not a car this time, but movement at the far end of the block, slow, deliberate, someone standing just beyond the reach of the light, not walking, not leaving, just there. And her breath slowed as she focused, trying to make out more, but the distance and the shadows kept it unclear. And that uncertainty was worse than confirmation, because it meant she could not predict what would come next. And she stepped back from the window carefully, her mind already adjusting again, because staying here was no longer just risky, it was temporary at best. And she glanced back toward him, still lying on the floor, still recovering, still unable to move on his own. And that made the situation even tighter, because whatever she decided next, he would depend on it completely. And for a brief moment, the weight of that responsibility pressed in harder than anything else, because this was not her world, not her fight, and yet somehow it had become both. And she closed her eyes for just a second, grounding herself, letting the noise of doubt pass through without stopping her, because hesitation would not help either of them now. And when she opened her eyes again, there was something different there, something more resolved. Because if trusting no one was the rule, then that meant she had to become the one he could trust, whether she was ready or not. And she walked back to his side, kneeling beside him again, her voice low but steady. "Then we do this my way," she said quietly, not as a challenge, but as a decision, because waiting was no longer an option, and staying was not a plan. And as she looked at him, at the man who had gone from stranger to responsibility in a single night, she understood that whatever came next would not be simple, would not be safe, but it would be necessary. And for the first time since she found him, the direction was beginning to take shape, even if the path ahead was still hidden in the dark. The decision did not echo out loud, but it settled into the room with a quiet certainty that changed the way Amara moved, the way she thought, the way she looked at the man in front of her, because this was no longer about reacting. It was about acting before something else did, and she could feel the time narrowing now, closing in around them with every passing minute. So she stood again, this time with purpose, scanning the small space not for comfort, but for anything useful, anything that could help her move him without drawing attention, because staying here was no longer an option she could rely on, not after what she saw outside, not after what he had said. And she moved quickly toward the back storage shelves, pulling down an old canvas apron, a spare jacket, anything that could break the clean lines of his appearance, anything that made him look less like someone worth noticing. And she returned to him, kneeling down as she carefully adjusted the layers around him, her movements precise, thoughtful, not rushed, because every detail mattered now. And as she worked, she spoke again, her voice low but steady, not expecting answers but needing him to hear her. "We cannot stay here," she said quietly, her eyes flicking once toward the door before returning to him. "And I cannot carry you far like this." And for a moment, there was no response, just the steady rhythm of his breathing. But then, slowly, his eyes opened again, more focused than before, more present. And he looked at her with something different this time. Not confusion, not just awareness, but understanding. And she saw it clearly. He knew what she was saying. He understood the risk, and even without words, that shared understanding tightened the space between them, turning two strangers into something closer to a team, however temporary, however fragile. And she leaned in slightly, her voice more direct now. "I need to know if you can feel your legs," she said carefully, choosing her words in a way that would not overwhelm him. And he did not answer immediately, but she watched the shift in his expression, the concentration, the effort, and after a few seconds, his gaze dropped slightly, then returned to hers with a subtle but clear response, a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. And that was enough to confirm what she had already suspected, enough to reshape her plan in an instant, because now she knew this was not just about helping him move. This was about moving him entirely, and that changed everything. So instead of asking more, instead of hesitating, she nodded once, more to herself than to him, already adjusting, already calculating what came next. And she stood again, her eyes moving toward the back exit this time, the one that led to the narrow service alley behind the diner, a path less visible, less exposed. And she walked over, unlocking it slowly, carefully, just enough to open it a crack, letting in a thin line of cool air as she listened again, holding still, her senses reaching out into the darkness beyond. And for a few seconds, there was nothing, just the soft drip of water from the roof, the distant hum of the city further away, but no immediate presence, no movement close enough to stop her. And she closed the door again gently, turning back toward him with a new kind of focus, because now she had a direction, not a perfect one, not a safe one, but a necessary one. And as she walked back to his side, her voice carried that quiet resolve again. "We are leaving," she said simply, not asking, not offering another option, because there was not one. And as she positioned herself beside him, preparing to move him again, the weight of the night shifted once more, not lighter, not easier, but clearer, because the next step had finally been chosen, and there was no turning back from it now. The moment she said it, the room seemed to tighten around the decision, as if even the walls understood there was no more time left to wait. And Amara moved without hesitation, sliding one arm carefully behind his shoulders while the other steadied the makeshift layers she had wrapped around him, her movements controlled but urgent, because now every second mattered, not in theory but in reality. And as she began to lift him, she felt the full weight of what she had committed to, not just his body but the responsibility that came with it, pressing into her muscles, into her breath, into the quiet determination that kept her from stopping. And he reacted this time, not with words but with a faint tightening of his jaw, a subtle sign that he was aware, that he felt the shift, and she leaned closer for just a second, her voice low and steady. "Stay with me," she said again, not as encouragement, but as instruction, because she needed him present, even if only barely, and slowly. Carefully, she maneuvered him onto the same utility cart she had used before, adjusting his position so he would not slip, securing the blanket tighter around him to keep him stable. And once he was in place, she paused, just for a breath, her eyes scanning the room one last time, committing it to memory in a way that felt final, because she knew she might not come back to it the same way again. And then she turned toward the back door, her grip firm on the handle of the cart as she moved forward, each step measured, each sound controlled, until she reached the door and stopped again, listening. Because this was the moment where everything could shift, everything could go wrong, and she waited, counting silently, letting the quiet outside settle into something she could read. And when nothing immediate answered her, she pushed the door open slowly, just enough to slip through, the cool night air brushing against her face as the narrow alley revealed itself, dimly lit, slick with rain, but empty, at least for now. And that was enough to move, enough to commit, and she guided the cart forward, the wheels rolling softly over the wet ground as she stepped out into the alley, closing the door behind her with a careful push that made no more sound than necessary. And for a moment, she stood still again, letting her eyes adjust, letting her senses reach outward into the darkness, because being outside changed everything. It exposed them in ways the walls had protected them from, and she could feel that exposure immediately, like stepping onto a stage she had not chosen. But there was no turning back, not now. So she began to move again, pushing the cart along the narrow path, keeping close to the shadows, choosing the darker edges where the light did not reach, her pace steady but cautious, because rushing would draw attention, and attention was the one thing they could not afford. And as she moved, she listened constantly, for footsteps, for engines, for anything that did not belong. And for a few seconds, there was nothing, just the quiet drip of water and the distant hum of the city beyond. But then, faintly, from somewhere behind the diner, a sound shifted. Not loud, not obvious, but different enough to make her slow slightly, her grip tightening as her eyes flicked back over her shoulder. And in that brief glance, she saw it again, not clearly, not fully, but enough, a figure at the far end of the alley, partially hidden, still, watching, and her breath steadied instead of breaking, because panic would not help her now. And she did not stop, did not react outwardly. She simply adjusted her path, turning slightly at the next narrow opening, moving deeper into the network of back streets she knew better than most, because this was her world, not his. And for the first time since the night began, that difference mattered, because here, in these hidden paths and quiet corners, she was no longer just reacting, she was leading. And as the distance between them and that figure slowly grew, one thing became clear: this was no longer just an escape. It was the beginning of something much bigger than either of them had planned, and the night was far from over. The alley stretched longer than it should have, each turn blending into the next until the city itself felt unfamiliar, like the path was reshaping around them. And Amara did not slow down, not even when her arms began to ache or when the wheels beneath the cart caught against uneven pavement, because behind her, somewhere beyond the turns and shadows, she knew that presence had not disappeared. It had only lost sight for a moment, and moments like that did not last. So she kept moving, her steps steady, controlled, her breathing measured in a way that kept her mind sharp, because panic had no place here, not anymore. And as she guided the cart through another narrow passage, the space opened slightly into a wider service road, one she recognized, one that led toward an older part of the neighborhood where buildings stood closer together and lights were fewer. And she paused there for the first time since leaving the diner, just long enough to listen again, her eyes scanning the edges of the darkness, searching for movement, for sound, for anything that would tell her whether they were still being followed. And for a few seconds, there was nothing, no footsteps, no engines, just the quiet hum of distant traffic and the soft drip of water from rooftops. And she let out a slow breath, not relief, but acknowledgement, because this did not mean they were safe. It only meant they had time, and time was something she could use. So she turned the cart again, guiding it toward A narrow side entrance tucked between two aging buildings, a place most people overlooked, a place she knew from years of moving through the city in ways others did not. And as she reached it, she pushed the door open carefully, leading him inside to a small, dim corridor that smelled faintly of dust and old wood. But it was dry, it was hidden, and for now, it was enough. And once inside, she closed the door behind them, the outside world sealing away again, leaving only the quiet space and the sound of his breathing returning to fill it. And she stopped there, her hands still resting on the card as she allowed herself a single moment to feel the weight of everything that had just happened. Not the fear, not the danger, but the choice, the line she had crossed hours ago that had now led them here, to a place where nothing was simple anymore. And she turned to him slowly, her eyes softer now, but no less focused, because despite everything, despite the risk, despite the uncertainty, he was still here, still breathing, still holding on, and that meant something. It meant her decision mattered, and she reached down, adjusting the blanket once more, her movements gentler now, more grounded, as she spoke quietly, not expecting an answer, not needing one. "We made it this far," she said, her voice calm, but carrying something deeper, something steady. "And we are not stopping here." And for a moment, his eyes opened again, just slightly, enough to meet hers with a clarity that had not been there before. And in that brief exchange, something shifted, not in the world outside, not in the danger still waiting somewhere beyond these walls, but between them, a silent understanding that whatever this had become, they were in it together now, bound not by choice anymore, but by the path they had already taken. And as his eyes slowly closed again, not fading but resting, Amara sat beside him, her back against the wall, her gaze steady as she listened to the quiet around them. Because she knew this was not the end, not even close. It was only the moment before everything changed, and somewhere out there, people with power were searching, systems were moving, decisions were being made. But in this small, hidden space, none of that mattered yet, because tonight, the man who once stood above it all was alive because of someone the world would never have noticed. And for the first time in a very long time, power did not belong to money or status. It belonged to the person who chose not to walk away.